Grizzly charges tourists. What happened next? Changed park rules. Forever, it was a perfect morning in Glacier National Park. Emily and Mark Thompson, visitors from Colorado, had just parked their SUV at the hidden lake trailhead, eager to explore. One of the park's most stunning hikes. Just as they began their hike, a loud, low rumble echoed from the trees behind them. The ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble. Emily turned, her camera still in hand, half expecting to see a bear from a distance. A common sight in the park, but one that always felt distant, safe. But this time, the sound wasn't distant. It was too close. A massive figure emerged from the forest, charging at them with incredible speed. A grizzly bear, its brown fur rippled with every stride as it barreled down the hill toward them, its eyes locked in a terrifying, focused gaze. The tourists near the trailhead scattered in panic, their screams blending with the bear's deep growl. Emily's heart raced as she grabbed Mark's arm, pulling him toward the trees. "Run!" she shouted, adrenaline surging, but the grizzly didn't seem interested in the others. Its eyes were locked on Emily and Mark, its body moving faster than either of them could react. It was coming for them, and it wasn't slowing down. In that moment, everything seemed to slow. The beauty of the morning, the quiet hum of nature, vanished as the bear's charge shook the earth beneath them. Emily's mind raced. She knew the park rules, knew the protocols, but nothing had prepared her for this. The grizzly was too close, too fast. The grizzly was upon them in an instant. Its massive paws pounded the earth as it closed the distance, its growls reverberating in the still air. Emily's heart hammered in her chest as she yanked Mark into the nearest tree line, desperate to put some distance between them and the charging bear. But the grizzly's speed was undeniable. It was a force of nature, unstoppable and relentless. "Emily, we can't outrun it!" Mark gasped, his breath coming in sharp, panicked bursts. He stumbled, his hiking boots catching on roots and rocks. "What do we do?" The answer wasn't clear, but instinct kicked in. Emily spotted a fallen log just ahead and, without thinking, dove toward it, pulling Mark down with her. They crouched behind the log, trying to make themselves as small as possible, but the bear wasn't fooled. It veered off course for a moment, then veered back toward them, crashing through the underbrush with terrifying force. Emily's thoughts were racing. She remembered the park's warnings. If you encounter a bear, stay calm, make yourself big, do not run. But how could she stay calm when the ground itself seemed to shake with every step the bear took? She squeezed Mark's hand tightly, her mind spiraling through everything she knew about bear encounters, knowing full well that nothing could truly prepare her for this moment. The bear was too close, too close. Then, as if by some miracle, the bear stopped just a few feet away from them, its massive chest heaving, nostrils flaring. Emily could see the raw power in the bear's eyes. It wasn't just a predator hunting for food, it was a wild force testing its limits, sensing the presence of two vulnerable humans in its territory. It sniffed the air, its attention divided between them and the sounds of other tourists who had scattered into the woods in panic. Emily's mind raced as she remembered the final rule: if a bear is too close and unyielding, do not make eye contact. Play dead if you cannot escape. But she couldn't bring herself to look away from the bear. It seemed to study them, as if it were deciding whether they were a threat or an easy target. The seconds stretched on, the tension so thick it felt suffocating. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the grizzly turned, its large frame moving with surprising grace for such a massive creature. The ground rumbled beneath its feet as it retreated, vanishing back into the forest, its heavy footfalls growing fainter with each passing second. Emily exhaled, the breath she didn't realize she'd been holding escaping her in a rush. She stayed frozen behind the log for what felt like an eternity, her hands trembling. Mark's voice broke through the haze of fear in her mind. "We're alive," he whispered, voice hoarse. He turned to her, his eyes wide with disbelief. That was too close. It took several minutes for Emily and Mark to gather the strength to move. The forest around them, once peaceful and serene, now felt ominous and alien, the sounds of nature distorted by the pounding of their hearts. Emily's mind was still racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. How had the grizzly stopped? Why had it backed off so suddenly? It didn't make any sense. Finally, Mark broke the silence, his voice shaking. "We need to get out of here, now." Emily nodded, her instincts telling her the same thing. She couldn't stay in the same spot, couldn't risk running into the bear again. But the way the animal had behaved, it hadn't attacked, hadn't gone for the kill. It was as if it had been testing them, pushing them to the edge, and that question gnawed at her. Why? The two of them carefully began making their way back toward the trailhead, moving in the opposite direction from where the bear had retreated. Emily kept looking over her shoulder, half expecting the grizzly to reappear, its massive body crashing through the trees again. The adrenaline from the encounter had worn off, leaving her with a shaky calm, but still the fear lingered, creeping up from her stomach to her chest. As they neared the trailhead, Emily's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of other tourists. Approaching, a group of hikers who had been in the area when the bear charged. They had seen the whole thing. And now, their wide eyes and hurried steps told Emily that the park would never be the same again. Not after this. "Are you okay?" one of the hikers asked, breathless from the climb. "We saw the bear. It was charging, and then it just stopped." "What happened?" Emily opened her mouth to speak, but found herself unable to find the words. The whole encounter felt surreal, like it was happening to someone else, not to her. She glanced at Mark, who had a look of pure shock in his eyes. "We're fine," he said finally, though his voice wavered. "But I think the rules need to change. This wasn't like anything we've heard about." The group of hikers nodded, their expressions grim. The shock of the encounter hadn't fully worn off for any of them. But Emily could see it now. The ripple effect of the bear's behavior, how it would change everything. The park had strict rules for bear encounters. Stay calm, stay in groups, never provoke. But what if the bear didn't follow the rules? What if the rules weren't enough? They made their way back to the visitor center in silence, the sound of their footsteps, the only thing breaking the eerie quiet. Emily kept replaying the moment in her mind, the bear's charge, the way it stopped just short of them, the way it had studied them with almost human curiosity. It wasn't hungry, it wasn't desperate, it was just testing them in a way she couldn't quite explain. As they entered the center, Emily's hand trembled as she reached for her phone, dialing the park rangers. She had to report what happened. The way the bear had acted needed to be shared, needed to be addressed before anyone else found themselves in a similar situation. But deep down, she knew that what had happened that day would change the park forever. The grizzly had broken the rules of nature, and in doing so, it had set in motion a chain of events that would force the park to rethink everything. How tourists interacted with the wild, how bears were monitored, and how safety protocols would evolve in a world where the unpredictable could happen at any moment. The grizzly's charge had not just shaken the ground, it had shaken the foundations of the park itself. By the time Emily and Mark returned to their cabin, the adrenaline had all but worn off, but the reality of what had happened still clung to them like a heavy fog. Emily sat on the porch, staring out at the vast expanse of the park, trying to wrap her mind around the bear's behavior. Mark paced behind her, his hands shoved into his pockets, lost in thought. "What do you think made it stop?" Mark asked, his voice tight. "Bears don't just charge like that and then back off. It was like it was testing us." Emily shook her head, the unanswered question gnawing at her. "I don't know. It didn't seem normal. Bears in the park have always been cautious around humans. They avoid us." She paused, her eyes focusing on the trees in the distance, a dark silhouette against the fading light of the day. But that one, it didn't seem to want to attack. It was almost like it wanted to see how we'd react. Mark exhaled sharply. Whatever it was, that kind of behavior's gonna change everything. The Rangers are gonna have to do something. Emily nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was at play. The more she thought about the encounter, the more she realized how unpredictable the wild truly was. The grizzly hadn't been acting out of hunger or fear. It had been testing boundaries, and she wondered if it was a sign of something deeper, something that the park wasn't prepared for. That night, the phone rang in their cabin. It was the park ranger, Kevin Lawson. "Emily, Mark." His voice crackled over the line. "We've been getting reports from the other tourists who saw the bear charge. They're all shaken up, and rightfully so. We've got to talk about what happened." Emily's stomach tightened. She knew what was coming next. "Kevin, the bear, it didn't just charge," she said, her voice calm but filled with the weight of what she had witnessed. "It stopped. It looked at us, almost like it was assessing the situation." There was a long pause on the other end. "I'm going to be honest with you. We've never had anything like this before. Grizzlies in this area usually keep their distance. But this bear, something's different. We're reviewing footage from the trail cameras, trying to figure out what's going on. We'll need to make some changes, and fast." Emily's mind raced. The thought of more encounters like this, encounters that left both tourists and wildlife vulnerable, was terrifying. "What do you plan to do?" "We're considering a temporary closure of some trails, especially those near known grizzly habitats," Kevin said. "We'll also be increasing ranger patrols and adjusting the protocols for bear encounters. It's clear that something in the bear's behavior is changing, and we need to address it before it escalates." The weight of his words sank in. This wasn't just a rare incident. It was the beginning of a shift in how the park would operate. The rules, the guidelines that had worked for decades, were no longer enough. The next few days were filled with reports, meetings, and discussions about new protocols. The rangers had already begun to implement new measures, increased signage along the trails, heightened awareness about grizzly behaviors, and a change in how tourists would be escorted through certain parts of the park. But as the park began to adapt, Emily and Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in the relationship between man and the wild. The grizzlies' actions had exposed a gap between what they thought they knew about nature and what it was capable of. The rules had been broken, and now everything would have to change. Emily sat on the porch again that evening, looking out over the vast landscape, now filled with questions. The beauty of the park, once so familiar and safe, felt different now. The grizzly had made sure of that. But she knew one thing for certain. Whatever the outcome, the park would never be the same again. The wild was unpredictable, and now the park's rules would have to catch up. It was 2 weeks later when Emily and Mark returned to Hidden Lake. The air was thick with the lingering scent of pine and earth, but the park felt different now. Signs posted along the trails warned tourists to stay alert, to be aware of bear activity, and to keep a safe distance from wildlife. Rangers patrolled more frequently, and groups of hikers were being guided through certain areas by trained personnel. But even with all the precautions in place, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the park had shifted. The grizzlies' charge had changed not only the way the park operated, but the way people thought about their relationship with the wild. It wasn't just about safety anymore. It was about respect. As they made their way down the trail, Emily and Mark were joined by a small group of hikers. They all kept to the same pace, eyes scanning the trees and the brush, watching for any signs of movement. The rangers had done their best to maintain the park's beauty and appeal, but now there was an underlying tension in the air. No one was completely sure what to expect, especially after the unprecedented behavior of the grizzly. Suddenly, the group fell silent. A low, rumbling growl echoed from deeper within the forest. It was distant, but unmistakable. "Bear, one." Of the hikers muttered under their breath. Emily's heart raced. Was it the same grizzly? Was it another attack waiting to happen? But then the growl softened, and from the trees emerged a familiar shape, a grizzly, but this time it wasn't. Charging. The bear, large and powerful, appeared calm, almost placid as it moved through the brush. It wasn't focused on the group, it wasn't aggressive. It seemed to be going about its business, feeding or foraging, not paying them any mind. The hikers stood frozen for a moment, waiting to see what the bear would do. Emily felt her breath catch in her throat. This was the same creature that had terrified her just weeks before. But now it was moving with purpose, completely uninterested in their presence. It was simply a part of the wild, a wild that had its own rules, rules that sometimes couldn't be understood by those who had only seen nature through human eyes. The bear disappeared into the trees, leaving only the faintest traces of its presence, broken branches, displaced rocks, the faintest scent of musk hanging in the air. Mark turned to Emily, his eyes wide. "It's different now, isn't it?" Emily nodded slowly. The rules have changed, and in that moment she realized the profound truth that had been set into motion by the Grizzly's charge. The park had always been a place of rules, guidelines designed to protect both humans and wildlife, but the Grizzly had broken those rules, forcing the park to reimagine the relationship between people and the wild. Nature wasn't something that could be contained by rules. It was unpredictable, wild, and sometimes terrifying. But it was also beautiful, raw, and honest. As Emily and Mark continued their hike, the weight of what had happened began to sink in. The park would go on, the rules would evolve, but the wild would remain unchanged, as wild as it had always been. And that was the one thing that would never be tamed. The Grizzly had charged, but in the end, it had also taught them something invaluable, that the wilderness could never be fully controlled. It could only be respected, understood, and learned from.